Architect Divya Chakravarti. She completed her undergraduate studies from SRM University and she went on to pursue her master's in historic preservation and urbanism and study of the built environment from the University of California, Los Angeles. She went on to work for the Department of Planning and Preservation for the city of Pasadena, California. She also did a brief stint of work for Historic Scotland, Edinburgh, UK. She also worked on conservation projects like Kalsa Mahal, Gokhale Hall in Chennai, and Marimalappa Educational Trust in Mysore. She is currently working as a director of Samrakshan Heritage Consultancy. She is also a co-founder of the Artisan Reprisal of Traditional Materials, Method and Technology. She goes on to conduct workshops to revive traditional and lost methods of construction.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series. This is for Bachelors of Architecture. The subject we are dealing with is architectural conservation, and the unit we will be looking into is conservation planning. The subtopics we will be delving into is conservation as a planning tool, financial incentives such as TDR, urban conservation and heritage tourism, case study of Pondicherry, and conservation project management. Conservation as a planning tool. Our historic buildings and districts give us a visual and physical link to the past in our changing urban landscape. Conservation is much more than just preserving a facade or an external shell of a building. It's very important that conservation and planning go hand in hand. It is not sufficient that when a planning department of a historic city or a historic core cannot leave the conservation architect out, and simultaneously when a conservation architect is working in a historic core, he cannot leave the planner out. It has to be a cohesive effort done by both of them to achieve a successful planning tool. It is also important that we retain the inherent spirit and original ambience of these historic buildings as far as possible. This requires an appreciation and understanding of the architectural structure of the buildings, good management and practice in conserving buildings. Our conservation guidelines are applied in varying degrees to the different conservation districts. So, when we think of conserving a building, then it does not affect a particular historic urban fabric. But when you are thinking about a historic district or a historic precinct, conservation becomes a very important tool, because it is not just an entire area that is getting like a new life, but the people of that area get a new life as well. It is not only refurbishment of a one particular area, but it affects the number of families as well as the city that this historic core exists in. Is it going to be a tourist oriented historic core? Is it going to be religious oriented? All of that is very important. So, good management as well as good practice in conserving buildings is important, but at the same time we need to analyze where these buildings exist and how this area is going to respond to the future. We have to take into consideration the historical significance of each conservation district, the context of the surrounding developments and the long-term plans for the area. The extent of the building to be conserved and the degree of adaptation allowed also varies by the district and in some cases by the uniqueness of the subject building. So, when we are talking about the architectural character of the building, it is equally important as much as the historical significance of the building, because as a layman or as the general people who live in that area, more than the historical significance, it is the architectural character, that is what the person can see on the facade of the building, that matters to them. So, we have to decide how is it that the external facade is going to attract the people or give them a sense of pride or belonging to that particular area. So, there should be a certain degree of adaptation that is required. The steps to be taken. The strictest form of building conservation is to be practiced in historic districts. These districts enrich our built environment with their diverse facades, rich ornamentation and unique architectural styles. To maintain the ambience and physical character of these historic districts, strict conservation guidelines should be put in place. And it's not sufficient that just strict guidelines are there. The local planning authority should also be involved while making these guidelines, and these guidelines should actually go a step further and become a policy or a legislation. So there is an afterthought that, okay, if I do not follow this, there shall be some consequences. What happens in a country like India is, with just mere guidelines, there is no stringent policy or rule or a law that makes a person do it. When it's a mere guideline, people take it for granted and it gets completely ignored. Buildings within these historic districts can be used for a diverse range of purposes, including commercial, community, and residential. So when you think of commercial, you can think of cafes, restaurants, hotels. Community, it could be a community center for children, a senior citizens center, it could be a learning center, a teaching after school hours school. And residential, as you all know, it could either be a single dwelling unit or a multiple family dwelling unit. This maintains the original character where different uses have evolved side by side. So even if the building and the current use cannot be done, okay, let us come up with a new use. So adaptive reuse is completely acceptable as far as the architectural character is not tampered with. We should encourage established trades and uses that are unique to each area that should remain. So when a particular area within that core is there, like for instance, you can take Mahabalipuram. There the shell craft is very famous and important. So if you are having the urban core over there and the shops related to that, you have to make sure that the local craft is first displayed. It is more important to have such shops than to have a particular shop from an outside area or outside place. Conservation of our built heritage is an important part of urban planning and development. Now, cities in transition. What do we actually mean by this? When you actually have a historic urban core and then you have over the years it has grown organically or inorganically depending on the place it is in, there are a lot of additions that have happened over a period of time, and there will be additions and changes that will continue to happen. So such cities are referred to as cities in transition. So you cannot say that Chennai has stopped developing now. It was Madras, now it is Chennai, and it will continue to develop into what it's going to be, as we will see. So it is only through guidelines and legislations that we can control the development for the future. Managing the ever-growing population of mega cities continues to be one of the crucial issues in the urban agenda of any developing country. A policy of urban decentralization that is limiting or discouraging growth within the core cities while encouraging population concentration in smaller urban centers in the periphery is an approach that has been commonly adopted. The differential growth patterns of peripheral urban centers at the agglomeration level, that is, there could be different ways a town grows or a city grows. Sometimes, like if you look at Mumbai, it grows in a different way because it's an island against the coast. Chennai has grown in a different way. Delhi has grown in a different way. So all of them, they have different urban centers at the agglomeration level. Yes, they all have grown, but it is at different ways, and differential growth patterns are definitely there. So it's by size as well as location relative to the core units. This has largely remained unexplored in the context of India. How have these patterns changed over time? What are the traits of the urban spread? What are the repercussions of such growth in the regional environment? The general expectation is that the real spread of the population in the peripheral areas, as evidenced in the rise in the number of growth of areas around the city. So what does that actually mean? It actually accompanies a theory that in the main urban core there is a slowing of the growth rate, and as this growth rate slows, the urban core is slowly going to wither away and die. So that is an unwanted result. Now we will take Delhi as an example. To decongest the walled city area and to maintain its heritage character, a comprehensive redevelopment plan for Jama Masjid area has been prepared, involving various government, non-government organizations or agencies and professionals for restoring the cultural heritage and past glory of Jama Masjid, Chandni Chowk and Red Fort area, what basically constitutes Old Delhi. The process of urban planning in Delhi is a continuous one right from the 17th century till date. In the 17th century, Shahjahanabad was built, which is now called the walled city. Next major change in expansion of urban Delhi happened in the second decade of the 20th century, when you have the Britishers coming in and they decided to make New Delhi, which is the capital of India. The next major expansion started during partition in 1947, when huge number of refugees decided to come and settle in Delhi. Delhi has undergone a lot of changes to manage with this full throttle of urbanization that it has been forcefully made to face. It has grown from a union territory to a full-fledged state with a capital, marking the establishment of New Delhi as well as simultaneously an existing Old Delhi, which is separate. Chandni Chowk in the second half of the 19th century, long before even New Delhi came into being, it was not even there in concept. Chandni Chowk, or the Moonlight Square as it translates to, was actually the city's main bazaar and cultural hub. It was the throbbing main vein of Delhi. Old Delhi's most famous avenue is now layered with haphazard building extensions, very thick netting of electrical cables, all kinds of encroachment, and it's nothing like what it used to be. But one thing remains, it's still a very famous commercial hub. If you look at the image over here, this is Chandni Chowk in mid-19th century. It might even look like a painting or something which is not even real anymore, but this is how Chandni Chowk looked. You had shops with the kind of veranda-like arrangement so they could protect themselves from the sun. The upper stories is where the tradesmen used to live, and for the shoppers to have a very good pleasant experience, they had lots of trees which provided shade, and on either side you had shops like this. This is the kind of shopping experience in the middle of 19th century. And look at Chandni Chowk today. You can clearly see what has happened. What is the main difference? Look at the difference in street width. It was incredibly wide and now it has become narrow. The second thing that is obvious is the removal of trees. This happened way earlier when the Britishers, because of a particular bomb scare, decided to go ahead and cut all the trees. The other thing that is now changed during the Shah Jahan's time, there was actually a canal in the original design which brought water from Yamuna. That again got destroyed during the Britishers' time itself. So what are the major differences between Old Delhi then and now? Today many people are actually moving out of Chandni Chowk. There are less and less people living there. Now it's becoming a commercial street entirely. So people are actually preferring to live in the open suburbs. So this exactly is what we were talking about. As the growth of the city happens in the periphery and the outskirts, the core of the city, people start moving out and it starts dying. At least for now, there is some commercial activity happening over here. But now if this city is not maintained or if it's let to go again to a worse state, even shops will start moving out from here and go to where people are. If people don't live here anymore, to have a market area where no people are there does not make sense. So it is not long before the entire market as well as moves. So the character is definitely changing. It's becoming more and more commercial and less residential. And in today's theory in urban planning language, everyone is looking for a 24-hour city. What do we actually mean by a 24-hour city? In today's times when safety is such an issue, we don't want to have a place where people work 9 to 5 and then that place becomes dead till the next morning. What happens then is you have a lot of antisocial activities happening when a city or a part of the city shuts down entirely. So it's important to have mixed use cities or 24-hour cities. In the sense, yes, morning there will be action because of commercial, office and trade activities, and there should be residences as well incorporated So there is activity even through the night. There is some activity of movement of people and vehicles even after the so-called working hours. So till now, organically, this is how Chandni Chowk was. Even before the urban planners came up with a term of 24-hour city, Chandni Chowk was a 24-hour city. But now, because of haphazard planning regulations and no guidelines, it's become completely commercial, which is a very great pity. And because the main cultural appeal of the city and the street is completely lost. Now, the next step of this, financial incentives and TDR. It's very important that when you have a historic property and you want to preserve it, as a government or a non-government organization, you provide some incentives to the owners so that they come forward and take some steps to help their building. So what are market-based incentives? They offer a powerful reason for the public at large to retain, care and invest in and responsibly rehabilitate historic buildings. You give them a purpose to do the right thing. Financial incentives offer a positive and more broad defensible reason for the public to get more involved with responsible preservation activities other than the fact that they are being forced to do so by the government. Once it just becomes thrusted upon, they are not doing it with interest. They will do it, they will try to find the loopholes, they will try to find the cheapest contractor, they will just want to be rid of the building and that kind of responsibility. So it has to be offered to them on a platter with some incentives that will help them digest and do a better job towards the building. Much more can be said about these finer points of preservation and their incentives, all of these which we will be looking at from an international perspective, because unfortunately in our country the system has not kicked in a level of laws and legislations. So we will just learn the kind of incentives that have been done in the United States, and they are well documented, widely understood not only by the American practitioners but also by the American public of historic cores and historic precincts. So these are the primary types of financial incentives to be examined. You have the income tax deductions, credits and rebates for property investment, tax incentives for donations to heritage organizations, third, easements, fourth, tax exemption for heritage organizations, 5, property tax abatements, 6, sales tax concessions or rebates, and finally grants. We will just take a look at 2 of them to see how relevant it is to our way of working on things. So let us look at easements. Easement is nothing but a form of donation. So it actually allows property owners to donate a part of their building. Physically they are still the property owners, but what they will actually do is, in exchange for diminished value of their rights, I will donate the facade of my building, which means I can give my house or the building in question to my children and to his children in return. But the facade of the property cannot be tampered with. Either the government or a non-governmental organization will purchase this facade, and in return I will get tax deductions on my income tax or property tax, which is quite large. The amount can be quite large. So I will be getting something, and I will give the government an opportunity to protect the facade of my building. So this is in perpetuity. Once I decide to donate an easement, I can continue reaping the benefits. Tax deductions will always happen forever and even to the future owners, but the easement also remains permanent. The next thing is property tax abatements. This is usually offered on a local level. It permits historic property owners or investors to claim a full or partial reduction, freeze or deferment of property taxes or rates, sometimes to help control the cost of a rehabilitation which has actually increased the property's value. So this is again a very useful thing that can be done. Both of these can be applied even in an Indian context as well. Now, what is TDR or transferable development rights? This is a very important kind of financial incentive offered in Europe and many other parts of the world. Transfer of development rights or TDR means making available a certain amount of additional built up area. In return, I will give the area relinquished or surrendered. The owner would give that up so that this extra built up area can either be transferred or sold for an agreed set sum of money. So when this happens all the time in our country between the government and a particular owner, when a road has to be widened, when a highway has to be widened. When a road has to be widened, a particular house might be there, a particular shop might be there. So government will actually take that area of the land that is required and give the equivalent amount in either some other area or either in terms of money. And usually the government deals with giving that particular area in some other particular region. But if we do the same thing for a historic building, it will make a huge difference as well. There will be a lot of people who come forward with their old properties wanting to repair them and restore them. What are the zones of TDR? Based on the intensity of development, the city is divided into intensely developed, otherwise A zone, moderately developed, otherwise called B zone, and sparsely developed, otherwise C zone. The transfer of development rights can be done only from intensely developed to the other zones and not vice versa. These are the financial incentives or fiscal measures that could happen or it should happen between INTAC and the local government. INTAC's advisory committee should engage in dialogue with the government to initiate the formulation of appropriate fiscal policies to promote conservation. INTAC should lobby for the provision for a heritage fund to be included in the annual or once in 5 years budget allocations of central and state governments. It should endeavour to ensure that local governing bodies have access to these funds through transparent mechanisms. The policy of the adoption of historic buildings or areas by competent and concerned community groups, trusts or private entrepreneurs of repute is very important. There is no way the harms or interests of the heritage building or the society in which it exists must be encouraged. So when you think of adoption as a very good way of preserving heritage in our country, because we have innumerable industrialists, corporates that work here. So they can actually take up a particular building or an area and make sure it is conserved or preserved well. But it has to be done hand in hand with the government. So the government acts like a watchdog and the private entrepreneur doesn't take any wrong measures or strict measures against them as well if required. The owners or caretakers of listed heritage buildings should be offered incentives by the way of favorable tax rebates, grants, loans or transfer of development rights and so forth. So we should encourage them and foster their interest in conservation of their cultural property. We should provide them with strong incentives for them to take up such a difficult project which consumes not only money but time and effort as well. Public authorities, private companies, governmental bodies and non-governmental organizations should be encouraged to offer adequate financial assistance to traditional craftspeople and agencies involved in craft promotion and trade. Another important part of conservation related craft and craft conservation. So it's very important that financial assistance is rendered even to such people, because it's only because of the craft that can conservation be continuing, and only if conservation is done will the craft continue. So it's a very interrelatable symbiotic relationship that has to be nurtured not only by the government but also by private enterprises and even the community at large. Now we will discuss the relationship between urban conservation and heritage tourism. There is actually a strong affinity between tourism and heritage, and that is very important leverage to promote conservation, because tourism gives the required money that conservation needs to be done well, especially for unprotected architectural heritage and sites. the potentials of domestic tourism, particularly pilgrimage tourism, needs to be developed. At the same time, there must be adequate safeguards to mitigate problems created by aggressive tourism promotion in areas where traditional communities and unprotected sites exist. Tourism can depend on heritage, and heritage also does depend on tourism, but it shouldn't come to an extent where the equation is not balanced and tourism is actually affecting the heritage and the heritage area and the people living in it. Heritage in recent times has superseded conservation, where marketing of heritage as a product according to the demands of the consumer, that is the tourist in this case, has resulted in complete commercialization of heritage, and conservation values are left far behind. Today, the symbiosis of both tourism and heritage places has become a major objective in the management and planning of historic areas. Parallel to the development of urban conservation has been the steady growth of cultural tourism in historic towns. In case of historic towns, tourism is not only added for an economic benefit, but plays an important role in conservation and economic regeneration. So, it not only helps to keep the place alive, but also the people in that city and town will keep their jobs, will get better jobs and better standards of living. Urban heritage has been conserved as a result of tourism interest. At the same time, a considerable amount has also been lost because of tourism. The main aim of urban conservation has become to satisfy the tourists. So, it should not be like that. Tourism should and conservation should not go to an extent where tourists are the driving force, but the conservation of the building and the area should be the driving force. For the tourism industry, heritage and history have become commodities that are actually sold to the tourists as a mere experience. Heritage is reduced to chosen interpretation of history, and its physical remains a marketing tool. Tourism increases the physical pressure on fragile environments and may be seen as a threat to the social unity or community. Making tourism work for historic towns and their conservation depends foremost on the objectives of development and the authority to control it. Both the authority and the objectives set by the authority have to be stringent and strong. For a high quality and desirable environment which is competitive and progressive, locally distinct yet globally acceptable, a delicate balance has to be sought in historic towns between desires of visitors and interest of resident and heritage. So, there should be a good balance between the two. So, there should be a balance between growth and the equality and quality of life, between economic development and the environmental costs. So, sustainable development is the key word here. That is very crucial. Urban conservation and tourism do go hand in hand. We will go forward to see what are the kinds of impacts they can have socially and economically. And tourism has to be made to work for historic towns. Otherwise, how is it that they will get money for conservation? But a very good rapport has to be created between tourism and conservation such that the historic towns do not lose their significance. At the very end of the lecture, we should have learned the following: conservation as a planning tool, financial incentives and TDR or transferable development rights, urban conservation and heritage tourism and their relationship. At the end, we should be able to answer the following questions: discuss how conservation can be used as a planning tool, name any two financial incentives used internationally, what is TDR, discuss what is the relationship between urban conservation and heritage tourism. That brings us to the end of the lecture. Thank you.